Now let's talk about the seismogenic index. The seismogenic index is a really interesting kind of methodology that was originally developed in Europe to study earthquakes associated with geothermal sites, CO2 injection, and so on. Cornelius Langenbroek did his PhD working with the seismogenic index with Professor Serge Shapiro, and came to work with me as a postdoc, and we undertook analysis of the question related to a decision by regulators in Oklahoma in early 2016. Remember, in early 2016, a magnitude 4 or larger earthquake was occurring every week. In early 2016, the regulators mandated a 40% reduction of wastewater injection volumes. Now, I've already mentioned the fact that the earthquake rate declined rapidly after this. But the question was, while it was declining it declining fast enough? Would it return to background levels? Was 40% too little? Should they have reduced wastewater injection more? Was 40% too much? How will induced seismicity in Oklahoma respond to the decreased saltwater injection rates? Now, one reason I was drawn to the seismogenic index model is that it's based on physical processes that I think are quite relevant. It assumes there's a random distribution of fractures and faults in the crust. I think that's a good assumption. They assign to those fractures and faults a distribution of fault strengths from a very weak fault to a very strong fault. Now, I would call a very weak fault a critically stressed fault. In other words, it's just at the right orientation for slip. And I'd call a strong fault a fault that's very poorly oriented for slip. But nonetheless, the terms are different, but the concept is the same. Some of the faults are critically stressed because they're just at the right orientation for slip. Some of them are very poorly oriented. It assumes that the process causing the triggering is the diffusion of pore fluid through the medium as a function of time. So I check. I agree with that model. And it has a triggering criterion that is basically that the pressurization rate and the seismicity rate are related to each other. So basically the seismic events are directly triggered by the pore pressure perturbation. It's a process that can be described by diffusion of pore pressure in a fluid-saturated and connected system, and the rate of events is proportional to the rate of injection. And it basically expands on the Gutenberg-Richter relationship, which we've talked about, and in two ways. It says the number of events is going to be dependent on two factors. One factor is what you're injecting, and one factor is what's called the seismogenic index, which is a characteristic of the crust in a given place. It's describing how many fractures and faults are there and how many are critically stressed. So there's a sort of an anthropogenic part, and there's a geologic part, okay? And the overall scaling is the B slope that's common in the Gutenberg-Richter relationship. So it gives us the ability to separate out the anthropogenic and the geologic parts. Now, we did this study at two periods in time. And in this first period, when Cornelius and I wrote this first paper and published it in 2016, we did not have a hydrologic model. And so what we really wanted to do was, in fact, in terms of the seismogenic index model, is say that the rate of events is proportional to the rate of pressure change. But we actually don't know that right now. And so we're going to assume that the pressure change is related to the rate of pressure change is the rate of injection. And so that's why that's the log of the volume as a function of time being injected. And so, here's what came out of all this. Basically, what we're looking at is the fit of our model and the predictions of our model based on the initial increase in the rate of injection, and then we use that to calibrate the model, and then follow it down the decay, and then because we don't have kind of a hydrologic model, we used a variant of what's called Amori's law. Amori's law is the law that says aftershocks die off as sort of one over time, and for induced seismicity, that rate is sort of 1 over time to some power p. So natural earthquakes, the p would be equal to 1. In some of the induced seismicity sequences studied by Langenbroek and Shapiro in Europe, p could be as large as 5, which would give a very rapid reduction in the number of earthquakes. So Cornelius and I assumed a p of 2 and predicted this decline in seismicity of the magnitude 3.5 and larger. That's shown in red, and magnitude 3 and larger, that's shown in green. So it's fitting the data, and then we're making a prediction forward in time. Now, one of the convenient things here, and we'll get back to the prediction here momentarily, is that having this kind of model, you can then talk about the probability of earthquake exceedance of a certain magnitude in a certain time period. So the background rate, which is shown in the top figure, said, as I pointed out before, that the probability of exceedance of a magnitude 4 earthquake is about, every year, is about 0.1, which would say there's a magnitude 4 earthquake about once a decade. As we were injecting more and more, this curve was shifting to the right, so that in the peak in 2015, there was a probability of 80% of getting a magnitude 5 earthquake. And so, we increased the probability very, very significantly by all of this injection, and that was a constant motion of this curve to the right. Now, the injection peaked in 2015, began to decrease in 2016. I didn't say, but the initial decrease in injection rate was caused by a drop in the price of oil. The subsequent decrease in injection rate was a combination of the drop in the price of oil and the regulatory action that was taken. So everything peaked in 2015, and then these curves started to move backwards, back toward the eventually the tectonic background rate. And so you could argue that between 2015 and 2017, the probability of a magnitude 5 decreased from about 80% to about 37%. So that's a very significant decrease in just a 2-year period due to that reduction in the injection rate. And so that's why these kinds of models are helpful. Now, our results were challenged, saying we're basically being too nice to the oil companies, and that the probability of future damaging earthquakes was being underestimated, okay? And basically, it was proposed that not the black line here, our proposal based on Amori's law, but something more like this gray line would be more reasonable. Many more earthquakes between 2017 and 2022 than we are predicting. Well, we looked at this in some detail and assigned uncertainties and point out the fact that while there's a lot of uncertainty in the cumulative number of earthquakes, our model expectation for magnitude 4.5 is up here, and the observed number is down here. So we're actually predicting more earthquakes than occurred. So we're being quite conservative. We're over-predicting the seismicity rate. In terms of the magnitude 5s, we're pretty much on the observed number. So we think we are being conservative. We've predicted more earthquakes than actually occurred. Now, to bring that 2016 work up to 2018, let's just pause for a second and kind of see what it was we were doing and when we were doing it. So in 2016, we we forecast this large-scale decrease and continued decreases. We'll show you that that forecast is still in agreement with the data. But in 2018, we wrote a second paper in which we actually developed, along with Weingarten, a hydrologic model that allowed us to extend our 2016 study. And so now we're able to extend our previous knowledge as well as to test our previous prediction. But what's happening now also, as I commented in the previous unit, is while the earthquakes associated with the fluid injection are going down, the hydraulic fracturing-induced earthquakes are going up. And now what we'll wind this up by demonstrating that perhaps the seismogenic index model is applicable to hydraulic fracturing earthquakes as well as earthquakes that are produced by produced water injection. So here's an update on our original prediction all the way up to 2019. And not only were we being conservative, we were grossly over-predicting the number of 3.5 earthquakes. So we're not up here. We're way down here. And so we think we were being pretty conservative, and we're fitting the larger earthquakes reasonably well. So first, just to be a bit defensive, our prediction in 2016 was not only conservative, it was overly conservative. But with Matt Weingarten, we actually extended this work by adding a hydrologic model. Now, this was really important because what the hydrologic model was able to tell us was we didn't have to, assume that the injection rate was proportional to the pressurization rate. We actually calculated the pressurization rate. Now, this is a pretty simple hydrologic model. It takes into account all the different injection wells. The only heterogeneity in the model is that we're assuming the Nemaha Fault is a flow boundary, and we're acknowledging that the pressure in the Arbuckle can never go up more than 2 megapascals. Otherwise, we'd have noted that, by having hydrostatic pressure in some of the injection wells. So it's not a highly constrained hydrologic model, but it's a reasonable one. Okay? And on the left, what you see is a prediction of the seismicity in 2000 based on what had been happening since 2017, and the place in which the pressure is increasing is the places in which the earthquakes are occurring pretty well. Now, we did something else in this model. So one thing we did is to calculate the hydrologic model and the absolute pressure change at the depth at which the earthquakes are occurring. The other thing we did is instead of calculating one seismogenic index for this region and one seismogenic index for this region, we calculated the seismogenic index on a much more granular scale. Okay? And you'll see that in a moment. So what we're really trying to do here is separate the geologic condition, the number and state of the pre-existing faults, from the perturbation on a granular scale in order to assess the potential for induced seismicity. And, of course, use that understanding to look at how things should be managed. And so basically, what we've done then is separated out very nicely the driving force, the pressure change as a function of space and time. We determine the seismogenic index on a local scale, and we determine the appropriate B value on a local scale, and then we're able then to calculate the potential for seismicity. So what we do with this seismogenic index is we're calculating it now for we have sort of seed points, and then for an area around that seed point, we use the number of earthquakes and the relationship between the injection rate and the earthquakes to scale the seismogenic index. And it's a logarithmic scale, so when you talk about 6.2 and 7.2, 7.2 means you're getting 10 times as many earthquakes for the same perturbation that you would before. And we show this on the left, so it's highly granular. That's mapping the seismogenic index. The yellow is the places where the crust is most susceptible to producing earthquakes. Okay? The blue is where the crust is least susceptible to producing earthquakes. And we do it on the data available up until 2014. We do it again using the data available up until 2015, and you see the pattern is very, very similar. We can add a few more areas because we get some earthquakes in those areas, but the pattern hasn't changed. Again, in 2016, the overall pattern hasn't changed very much, and in 2017, it hasn't changed. So basically, one would expect if the seismogenic index is actually a map, a quantitative map of the geologic sensitivity to perturbations, it should be stationary in time, which I would argue it is. So now, because we know what's happened, we can actually make physics-based forecasts of the probability of, say, a magnitude 4. And what we're doing is showing those magnitude 4s with yellow stars and the background seismicity. And you see a very good correlation between where we're calculating a high probability. Again, the seismogenic index is defined for these areas of 20-kilometer radius and which are moved around on the map. And the high seismogenic index leads to a high probability, incorporating, of course, the appropriate pressure and perturbation. And it's holding up, pretty well through 2018 when we published the paper. And, of course, we can test it now against more recent seismicity. Here's a more detailed view of how things evolve, and I would argue that to first order, where the bigger earthquakes are occurring and where the most earthquakes are occurring is pretty well matched by the data, which then incorporates both the seismogenic index and the pressure change coming from the hydrologic model. And, what does it mean for you? What does it mean for regulators? Well, it means for you, where do you live? Do you live in one of these hotspots where you're particularly sensitive? And what does it mean for regulators? It means regulators, can allow more injection in some places than others because they're less susceptible, for example. Or if they're considering scenarios such as, well, maybe we could allow the injection rate to increase in some areas, what would the result be? We could calculate that. So, we used a scenario for these calculations that the post-2016 injection rates would be unchanged, and we just kind of kept them constant, but we could have assumed other things and actually made predictions on that basis. Now, I mentioned before that earthquakes are occurring associated with hydraulic fracturing, and right now this is work in progress by Cornelius and I. We've reduced the radius of the seismogenic index calculation to 10 kilometers. To need to be closer to the source, and we're looking at the percentage of seismogenic regions as a function of the total injected volume, and you see the larger injected volumes are associated with the most seismogenically active areas. We've broken this up into 4 different areas: Anadarko North in blue, the Stack in green, the Scoop in dark orange, and the Arkoma in sort of light orange. And we've used the Oklahoma Geological Survey's method for identifying earthquakes associated with hydraulic fracturing. And, there are various ways of doing this. We could have done something different, but we thought just to be consistent and not, when we look at our results, not wonder whether they were the result of actually using a different criterion and a different catalog. We decided to simply use the OGS catalog and not have that as a variable. Now, what this is showing is the seismicity correlated to hydraulic fracturing. If you look at all of Oklahoma, the blue shows the distribution of hydraulic fracturing per 310 square kilometers. That's a radius of 10 kilometers. And the red shows the distribution of areas with any seismicity at all. And so the probability that an earthquake will occur is sort of, you divide one by the other, and for the very largest injection, you find the higher probability, okay? So if you look at all of Oklahoma, if you apply the frac batch model and only use the earthquakes which are clearly identified as being associated with hydraulic fracturing, you go through the same analysis, and now, it's a much better correlation between the occurrence of earthquakes and large fluid volumes. So the probability of hydraulic fracturing induced seismicity is increasing with the volume of injected fluid. Okay, so this is taking the state as a whole. Now, there are other parameters that we need to look at. How long is it taking to inject this fluid, for example, and so on. But right now, the analysis has always only been done on total injected volume. Now, rather than look at Oklahoma as a whole, which is the black line relating the number of earthquakes to the injected fluid volume on this plot, we can break these four areas out separately, and the slope of this line is in fact the seismogenic index, the number of earthquakes per fluid volume. And you see the green line has the lowest seismogenic index, which is here, and the blue line has the highest seismogenic index up here. The B value fluctuates somewhat, but around a constant value of about 1.25, and those uncertainties will be taken into the area. But what this is saying is Anadarko North has a higher seismogenic index than the Arkoma area, for example, and it'd be more likely to produce seismicity in response to the same perturbation. How do these numbers compare to values that are widely observed in other areas? As I mentioned earlier, the Shapiro's group developed the seismogenic index model to look at fracking-induced earthquakes associated with geothermal sites and other sites initially. And as time has gone on and they've done other sites in blue, we show sedimentary rocks. In red, crystalline rocks. The earthquakes here are down in the crystalline rocks, and you can see the numbers we're getting, around -2 to -2.2, are sort of, in this range here, pretty, consistent, but importantly, constant through time, okay? We're really mapping something which is a characteristic of the Earth and not the perturbation. So because these areas have different seismogenic indices, we can now talk about the probability of earthquakes in response to a given amount of hydraulic fracturing fluid. And in fact, that probability for a magnitude 4 is about 40% for the Scoop and about 10% for the Arkoma area. And so, a full factor of 4 difference based on the different characteristics of those areas in terms of how much injection is going on and what the seismogenic index is. We can then, look at what the current volumes are in those 4 areas, and then you can basically connect the lines going across and argue if for a magnitude 4 earthquake, the amount of injection that's happening in the Scoop is going to result in this 40% probability. So it's a function both of the injection and of the seismogenic index. They're actually injecting more, appreciably more, in the stack, but the probability is about the same because it's got a lower seismogenic index, okay? In the Anadarko area and the Arkoma area, the injected volumes are appreciably less, but the probability is twice as high in the Anadarko area because the seismogenic index is higher. So you can basically see how area and perturbation kind of are combined in order to illustrate what's going on. So, the result of the most recent work then is that it does appear that hydraulic fracturing is inducing seismicity, and it suggests, at least at this point in time, perhaps limiting hydraulic fracturing volumes could be an effective strategy to manage the hydraulic fracturing-induced seismicity. More on this as the research goes forward.